Jake had always dreamed of seeing the world, but life had never been kind enough to make that possible. He was a backpacker, traveling on a shoestring budget, making his way through the roughest and least expensive paths. The mountains had always called to him, and now, after months of trekking across different landscapes, Jake found himself in the northern wilderness, ready to take on another adventure. The thrill of being on his own, relying on his skills and instincts to survive, was what kept him going. He didn't have much, just a few worn-out clothes, a small backpack, and a stubborn hope that someday he'd find something bigger than the meager life he led. This trek was supposed to be his last one before heading back to the small town where he'd grown up. But as the days turned into nights and the mountains seemed to stretch on forever, Jake's excitement began to wane. He had run out of money weeks ago, relying only on the few odd jobs he could find along the way. One evening, as he made his way up the narrow mountain trail, the weather began to turn. It had been a calm day, with a soft breeze rustling the leaves in the trees, but that serenity soon turned into a menacing chill. The sky, once a soft blue, now turned gray, and the winds began to pick up speed. Jake paused for a moment to take in the changing scenery, his breath visible in the sudden cold. Could be a storm coming, he muttered to himself, pulling his jacket tighter around his body. He had been through storms before, but this one felt different. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive, and the clouds above churned like dark, swirling beasts. Not wanting to risk getting caught in the storm, Jake decided to find shelter. There was a small village not too far ahead, or so he hoped. But the trail was unfamiliar to him, and the visibility was already starting to fade as snowflakes began to fall, lightly at first, but then harder, swirling around him in a chaotic dance. The wind howled, and Jake knew that his chances of finding the village now were slim. He had two choices: turn back and risk getting stuck in the wilderness, or keep moving forward, hoping to find shelter before the storm reached its peak. Jake chose to keep moving. With each step, the wind grew stronger, the snowflakes sharper. His heart raced as the storm picked up speed. The path was becoming more and more difficult to follow, the snow now thick and blinding. That's when he saw it, a faint glow in the distance. He wasn't sure whether it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but the flickering light seemed to beckon him. With renewed hope, Jake pushed forward, his legs growing weary as the wind pounded against him. The light grew brighter as he got closer, until he could make out the shape of a car. Parked at the edge of the trail, as he neared the vehicle, Jake could see that the windshield was covered in snow, and the car itself was barely visible in the growing storm. His heart sank. It wasn't a safe place to stay. The car was stuck in the snow. The doors were closed, and there was no sign of anyone inside. The snow was piling up around it quickly, and Jake knew if the storm didn't let up soon, it could become dangerous. But as he approached, something caught his eye. A faint movement inside the car. Someone was there. His instincts kicked in. Without a second thought, he rushed to the car and knocked on the window. The movement stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but the howling wind. Jake knocked again, louder this time. A muffled voice came from inside. "Help me," it said. The words were barely audible above the storm, but they were enough to make Jake's heart race. He quickly moved to the other side of the car, finding the door handle buried under a thick layer of snow. His hands, already freezing from the cold, fumbled with the handle until it finally gave way. He pulled open the door and was hit by a blast of frigid air. Inside the car, a woman sat, huddled in the seat, her face pale and frantic. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. She was shivering, her lips blue, and her clothes were thin, far too thin for the freezing weather. "I'm stuck," she said, her voice shaky. "I was driving and got caught in the storm. I can't get the car started, and now I don't know what to do." Without wasting another moment, Jake gently helped the woman out of the car, guiding her to her feet. She stumbled at first, clearly weak from the cold, but with Jake's help she managed to stand. The snow was falling heavily now, and the wind was relentless. There was no time to waste. "We need to find shelter," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Come on, we'll be okay. We just need to get out of this storm." Together they made their way through the swirling snow, the woman's steps unsteady at first, but slowly gaining strength. They walked in silence for a while, the wind howling around them, the snow stinging their faces. Jake's mind raced. He had no idea where they were heading. He didn't even know if there was any shelter nearby. But he couldn't leave her alone, not in this weather. They stumbled through the snow for what seemed like an eternity. Jake could feel the woman's grip on his arm growing weaker, and he knew that if they didn't find shelter soon, they were both in serious trouble. Finally, through the blinding snow, he spotted something up ahead, a dark shape in the distance. A cave. It was small, but it was something. Jake hurried toward it, urging the woman to keep going. They finally reached the entrance, and Jake pulled her inside out of the storm. The cave was cold, but at least it offered shelter from the wind and snow. Jake quickly started a fire with some dry wood he found in the cave, his hands trembling as he worked. The woman, now visibly exhausted, collapsed against the cave wall, her breathing shallow. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. "I didn't know what I was going to do." Jake glanced at her, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "You're safe now. We'll make it through this." The woman nodded but didn't say anything more. Jake couldn't help but wonder who she was. She looked like she had money. Maybe too much money for someone to be out here in the middle of nowhere, stuck in a snowstorm. But Jake didn't ask. It didn't matter. What mattered now was getting through the storm. As the fire crackled, the cave began to warm up, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this night was going to change everything. The storm had brought them together, but Jake had no idea that this chance encounter would turn out to be far more than just a random meeting. The storm raged outside, but inside the cave, the warmth from the fire made the cold seem like a distant memory. Jake had managed to gather enough dry wood to keep the flames alive, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the small space. The woman, whose name Jake still didn't know, was sitting near the warmth, her body shaking less now as the fire did its work. She seemed calmer, though her face still looked pale and exhausted. Jake took a seat across from her, keeping a respectful distance. He wasn't sure what to say. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it felt heavy. He wanted to ask her more about how she ended up in the mountains, but he didn't want to push her. She had been through a lot already. Instead, he decided to break the silence. "Are you hungry?" he asked. His voice was softer than he intended. He wasn't sure what kind of food she might have, but he had a small stash of granola bars in his bag. He figured they might be better than nothing. The woman looked at him with a small, grateful smile. "I could eat something," she replied. "Thank you." Jake reached into his bag and pulled out a granola bar, offering it to her. She took it from him, breaking it in half, and handed him a piece. Jake accepted, though he wasn't particularly hungry. He just wanted to make sure she was okay. As they ate in silence, the woman finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were still trying to gather the strength to speak freely. "I'm sorry," she said, looking up at him. "I haven't introduced myself. My name is Sophie." She paused for a moment, as if thinking carefully about what she said next. "I'm not from here. I don't usually travel like this, but something came up and I had to leave." Jake nodded, understanding the unspoken words. He didn't press her for details. Everyone had their reasons for doing things, and sometimes those reasons were not easy to explain. Sophie looked around the cave, her eyes lingering on the fire, her face reflecting a mix of emotions that Jake couldn't quite place. It was then that he realized how out of place she seemed in this wilderness. She wasn't dressed for this kind of weather. Her clothes were fine, but they were clearly not meant for an impromptu mountain hike in the middle of a snowstorm. The realization made him even more determined to keep her safe. "I didn't expect to get caught in a storm like this," she said, her voice quieter now. "I thought I'd be fine. I thought I'd make it through without any problems." Jake could tell she was trying to make sense of what had happened. "Yeah, it can catch you off guard. These storms roll in fast. 1 minute it's clear, and the next, you're stuck." He offered a small smile. "But you're not alone. We'll figure it out." Sophie gave him a faint smile in return, though it seemed more out of politeness than true amusement. The fire continued to crackle, and they both sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. The storm outside didn't show any signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The howling wind was now a constant roar, and the snow was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, covering everything in sight. Jake wasn't sure how long they'd be stuck here. It could be hours, or it could be days. He wasn't exactly an expert on how these storms worked, but he knew they had to stay put for now. There was no use in trying to venture out in this weather. "We should get some sleep," Jake suggested, breaking the silence once again. "We'll need to rest up for whatever comes next." Sophie nodded. her shoulders relaxing a bit as she shifted to make herself more comfortable. Jake didn't have much in the way of extra gear, but he had a thin blanket in his backpack. It wasn't much, but it would help. Sophie pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Jake didn't want to intrude on her space, so he leaned against the cave wall, using his backpack as a makeshift pillow. He kept his eyes on the fire, listening to the wind outside, trying to steady his thoughts. As the hours passed, the temperature in the cave dropped, and even with the fire, the cold was biting. But Sophie seemed to be managing. She hadn't said much more after their earlier conversation, and Jake didn't press her. He knew how it felt to be alone, to be trapped in your own thoughts. Sometimes the best thing was just to sit in silence and let the time pass. In the quiet darkness, Jake drifted in and out of sleep, the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of Sophie's breathing the only comfort in this strange situation. The storm outside continued to rage, but for the moment they were safe. The next morning, Jake woke to the dim light of early morning creeping into the cave. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, and the air was still cold, though not as bitter as it had been the night before. Sophie was still asleep, her face relaxed now, her body curled up for warmth. Jake stretched and quietly added some more wood to the fire, watching as the flames began to grow again. The storm outside had subsided slightly, but it was still snowing heavily. He couldn't see much beyond the entrance of the cave, but the fresh snow outside seemed untouched, as if no one had passed through in hours. He glanced at Sophie again. She looked so vulnerable there, so far from whatever life she had come from. It was hard to imagine someone like her out here, stranded in the middle of nowhere. He knew she hadn't expected to end up in this situation, but he wondered if she'd been here before or if her life was always so perfect. It was a strange thing to consider. Jake didn't know much about her, but he knew enough to understand that she wasn't just an ordinary person. There was something about her, something that made him feel like he should take extra care, something that made him feel protective of her. Maybe it was the way she looked at the world, the way she spoke in a soft, almost distant voice, as if her thoughts were always elsewhere. Maybe it was the way she had seemed so lost in the storm, so helpless and yet so strong at the same time. Sophie stirred, and Jake quickly looked away, not wanting to make her feel self-conscious. She slowly sat up, rubbing her eyes and stretching. Her gaze met his, and she offered a weak smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," Jake replied, his tone casual, though he was relieved to see her awake and okay. The two of them spent the next few hours in the cave waiting out the storm. They talked a little more, though the conversation was mostly light. Sophie shared a few more details about herself, though she still kept much of her past a mystery. Jake didn't mind. He wasn't in any rush to know everything about her. He was just glad that she was still there, still safe. Outside, the storm eventually began to quiet down. The winds had lessened and the snow was falling more softly. Jake knew that they had to keep moving. It was too dangerous to stay in the cave for much longer. "Let's try to head down to the village," Jake suggested. "It might be a little safer there." Sophie nodded, her eyes looking out at the white world beyond the cave entrance. "Lead the way." The storm outside had softened into a light snow, and the world around them had transformed into a quiet, wintry landscape. The mountains, which had once seemed so imposing, now stood peaceful and still under a soft blanket of snow. Jake and Sophie stood at the mouth of the cave, looking out at the vast white expanse. "Do you think we can make it down to the village?" Sophie asked, her voice tentative as she scanned the snow-covered trail ahead. Jake thought for a moment, considering the terrain. The storm had passed, but the snow still lay thick, and the path would be difficult to navigate. He had a map in his bag, though he wasn't sure how much good it would do now. The snow was covering everything, and the landmarks were no longer visible. "We'll have to be careful," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But we've made it this far. We can't stay here forever." Sophie nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. She glanced at the cave, then back at Jake, her eyes searching his face for any sign of certainty. She was trusting him, and that trust made Jake feel a sense of responsibility he wasn't used to. "All right," she said after a moment. "Let's go." They gathered their things, making sure to leave the cave as tidy as possible. Jake checked his gear one last time, making sure he had everything he needed. His map, a few more granola bars, his jacket, and a small flashlight. Sophie had nothing more than the clothes on her back and a small purse that she carried with her. "Ready?" Jake asked, offering her a smile. Sophie gave a small, almost hesitant nod. "Yeah, let's do this." They stepped out into the snow, the cold air hitting them immediately. The world was eerily quiet now, with only the sound of their boots crunching in the snow breaking the silence. The storm had calmed, but the snow was still falling gently, covering their footprints as soon as they made them. The ground was uneven, and Jake had to be careful with each step, his boots sinking deep into the snow in places. Sophie was slower than Jake, her steps less sure as she tried to keep up with him. Jake offered a hand to her every now and then, guiding her over the trickier parts of the path. Though they hadn't talked much yet, there was a quiet understanding between them. They were both trying to stay calm, but it was clear that Sophie was a bit out of her element. Jake kept his pace steady, trying not to let his concern show. He had been in the mountains before, but this was different. It wasn't just the weather, it was Sophie. She wasn't used to this kind of travel, and Jake could tell that she was uncomfortable with the rough terrain. She wasn't complaining, but the way she looked at the snow, as if trying to figure out how to navigate it, told him everything he needed to know. They walked in silence for a while, the cold air biting at their faces, and the wind occasionally picking up again, though not as fiercely as before. The snow seemed to be everywhere, a never-ending sea of white stretching out in all directions. Jake could barely make out the trail, and his heart started to race a little. The path was getting steeper, and the snow was piling up faster than he expected. "Hey, I think we might need to find some shelter again," Jake said, his voice firm but calm. Sophie nodded, her face flushed from the cold. "You think we can make it down to the village?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure anymore. The village was supposed to be just a few miles away, but with the snow and the way the trail was disappearing under the blanket of white, it was hard to say how much further they had to go. "I think we need to find somewhere safe first," he said, looking around. "There's no point in risking it. If the storm picks up again, we could end up worse off." Sophie looked at him, her eyes still filled with uncertainty, but she didn't argue. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's find shelter." Jake scanned the area, trying to find a place where they could wait out the storm. A large boulder up ahead seemed like a good spot. It wasn't much, but it would offer them some protection from the wind. He pointed it out to Sophie, and together they made their way toward it. By the time they reached the boulder, the wind had started to pick up again and the snow was falling more heavily. They huddled behind the rock, trying to shield themselves from the worst of it. "We'll rest here for a bit," Jake said. "It's not much, but it's better than being out in the open." Sophie nodded, grateful for the break. She sank down onto the snow, pulling her knees up to her chest to conserve heat. Jake did the same, though his mind was racing. They needed to keep moving, but he wasn't sure if the storm would let up enough for them to continue. For a while they sat in silence, watching the snow swirl around them. The wind howled, but it was muffled by the boulder, and they were both able to catch their breath. Sophie pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, and Jake did the same, trying to conserve as much body heat as he could. "I didn't expect to be stuck out here," Sophie said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jake looked at her, surprised by the words. "Yeah, me neither. But at least we've got each other's back." Sophie smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't think I've ever felt this helpless," she admitted. "I've been through a lot in my life, but this is different. I'm not used to depending on anyone." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He had never been one to rely on others either, but in this situation it felt like they had no choice. He wasn't sure what kind of life Sophie led before this, but it was clear that she wasn't used to being in situations like this one. "You don't have to do this alone," Jake said quietly. "We're in this together." Sophie looked at him then, and for the first time Jake saw a real smile on her face. It was small, but it was there. "Thanks," she said softly. "I don't know what I would do without you right now." Jake nodded, his gaze drifting back to the snow-covered trail. He didn't know what they were going to do next, but he wasn't about to let her face it alone. The snowstorm had become a test of endurance, both physically and mentally. Jake could feel his legs growing tired from the cold and the uphill climb. But they couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving. After what felt like hours, the snow began to lighten again, the clouds breaking up and revealing a glimpse of the pale blue sky. It was a brief moment, but it gave them both a small sense of hope. "We can do this," Jake said, standing up and brushing the snow off his pants. Let's go. Sophie stood up with him, her face set with determination. The shelter had been a much-needed break, but it was time to move forward. Together, they pushed on, the trail still hard to follow but a little easier to navigate with the snow letting up. The village was still far away, but they could make it. They had to. Jake led the way, Sophie following close behind. They both knew that the hardest part wasn't over, but they had taken the first step toward getting out of the wilderness and back to safety, and with each step, they were one step closer to finding the village and whatever came next. By the time Jake and Sophie made it to the base of the mountain, the storm had finally calmed, and the air felt different, lighter somehow. It was still cold, and the snow covered everything in a thick blanket, but the relentless wind had quieted down. The sky was clear again, revealing an almost golden light, like the storm had washed everything clean. They had walked for what felt like hours, the steady crunch of their boots in the snow marking each step. The village was still a few miles away, but the end of the storm made the journey feel possible again. Jake turned to Sophie, who was still keeping pace with him, though her breath came in visible puffs in the frigid air. Her face, which had been pale from exhaustion and fear earlier, now looked a little more at ease. She was no longer stumbling. Her steps had become more assured, though still cautious. She wasn't saying much, but Jake could tell that the experience had changed her. She was becoming stronger, more grounded with each mile. "How are you doing?" Jake asked, keeping his voice light. Sophie gave him a small smile, though it was tinged with fatigue. "I'm all right. Tired, but I'm glad we're making progress." Jake nodded, watching the trail ahead. The landscape around them was breathtaking, the snow clinging to the trees like a fairy tale, and the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks just barely visible under the fading sunlight. Despite the beauty of it all, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. They were far from civilization and anything could happen. He wasn't sure if they had truly escaped the storm. They continued down the mountain, the trail getting easier to navigate as they neared the bottom. The snow was not as deep here and the path became more defined, but the cold was still biting. Sophie had pulled her jacket tighter around her, her shoulders hunched against the chill. Jake felt a strange sense of responsibility toward her. He hadn't expected to find someone in this situation, but now that he had, he couldn't help but care about her well-being. "Do you want to stop for a minute?" Jake asked, noticing that Sophie was slowing down a bit. She nodded, her breath coming out in short bursts. "I think that might be a good idea." They found a large boulder just off the trail and sat down, leaning against it for support. Jake pulled out one of the last granola bars he had, offering it to Sophie. She took it gratefully, though she didn't say much. It was clear that the journey had taken its toll on her. As they rested, Jake couldn't help but wonder about Sophie's life before this, before the storm, before the hike. She had been so quiet about her past, only giving him bits and pieces. She didn't seem like the kind of person who would normally be hiking in the mountains, at least not in these conditions. But she was here and she was holding her own. There was something about her that intrigued him. He turned to her, trying not to seem too intrusive. "So where are you from?" Sophie looked at him for a moment, her gaze distant. "I live in the city. I work for my family's company." Jake raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press further. He could tell that Sophie wasn't ready to talk about it yet. The way she spoke made it sound like she wasn't too happy with her life back there. But that was something she would have to share when she was ready. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Jake added, offering a reassuring smile. Sophie met his gaze, her eyes softening. "It's not that," she said quietly. I don't know how to explain it. Sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in a life I didn't choose. Everything's planned for me and I feel like I don't have control. I don't know what I want or what I'm supposed to do." Jake listened carefully, trying to understand. He didn't have the answers, but he knew how it felt to be unsure, to feel lost in the world. He could see the weight of her words in her eyes, the way they made her seem both distant and burdened. "That sounds rough," Jake said softly. "But you're out here now, and that means you're doing something different." "It's a start," Sophie smiled faintly. "I guess you're right. I didn't expect to end up here, but I'm glad I did. I don't think I would have made it through without you." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, he had just helped her when she needed it. But hearing her say that made him realize just how much this journey had changed both of them. It wasn't just the storm they had survived. It was everything that had led them to this moment, the unexpected connection they had formed along the way. They stayed there for a while longer, resting and gathering their strength. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the snowy landscape, and for the first time since the storm had hit, Jake felt a sense of peace. They were going to make it. The village was close, and they could make it through the night there, where it would be warm and safe. When they stood up again to continue walking, the air had taken on a different quality. The cold was still there, but it wasn't as harsh. The wind had died down and the snow was lighter, like the world was preparing for a calm night. The path ahead was more manageable, the way clearer now that the storm had passed. They walked together, the distance between them shrinking with each step. It was clear that their bond had deepened during their time in the wilderness, and even though they hadn't known each other for long, it felt like they had been through something life-changing together. As they neared the village, the sounds of distant voices and the faint glow of lights in the distance reached their ears. The sight of civilization was a welcome relief, and Jake felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. They had made it. When they reached the village, it felt like a different world. The buildings were warm and inviting, and the streets were bustling with people preparing for the evening. They made their way to a small inn where Jake arranged for a room for the two of them. Sophie seemed relieved but also a little overwhelmed by the change from the quiet wilderness to the noisy village. "Thank you," Sophie said quietly as they entered their room. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Jake smiled, though he could sense a shift in the air. Sophie seemed different now, quieter, and Jake could tell that the adventure had left its mark on her. He wasn't sure what the next step was for either of them, but for now they were safe, and that was all that mattered. As they settled into the room, Sophie turned to him. "I guess we're not so different after all." Jake raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "You came out here to find something," Sophie said softly. "And I came out here to escape something, but in the end we both ended up in the same place." Jake nodded, not knowing what to say. He hadn't been looking for anything. At least not in the way Sophie seemed to be, but maybe that was the point. They had both found something in each other that they hadn't expected to discover. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like maybe he had found the beginning of something worth holding on to. The next morning, the village felt like a completely different world. The air was warmer, the streets more familiar, and the gentle hum of daily life was all around them. The relief of being in a safe place made it almost hard to believe that just a day ago, they had been battling a fierce snowstorm in the middle of nowhere. The contrast between the quiet wilderness and the bustling village was stark, and for a moment Jake wasn't sure if he was dreaming. Sophie was sitting by the window, looking out at the busy streets below. The sun had come up and the light was streaming into the room, filling the space with warmth. She seemed deep in thought, her eyes far away as she watched the villagers going about their day. Jake sat across from her, sipping his coffee and letting the silence stretch between them. "Do you think we'll be all right?" Sophie asked suddenly, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a question that had been lingering in her mind. Jake paused, taking a moment to consider. "We're safe now," he said finally, though it didn't feel like the end of their journey. It wasn't just the physical storm they had survived, it was something deeper, something that neither of them had fully faced yet. "But I think we both have a lot to figure out." Sophie turned her gaze back to him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I've always had a path laid out for me, but after everything that happened, I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads." Jake leaned back in his chair, giving her some space to gather her thoughts. He had known from the beginning that Sophie wasn't like the others he had met on his travels. She wasn't just another person in the crowd. She was someone who had been shaped by a life that felt distant and almost unreachable. The kind of life where everything was planned, every decision made for her. But now, in the quiet of this village, away from all the noise of her old life, she had to confront the truth of who she really was. "I get that," Jake said quietly, his voice calm. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Take your time." Sophie nodded, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her cup. "I've never had time before. Time to think, to breathe. It's always been about the next thing, the next task, the next event." She sighed, leaning back in the chair. "But now I don't know where to go." Jake could see the internal struggle on her face. It wasn't just about where she was going physically. It was about what her life had become. She had been trapped in a world of expectations, and now that she had stepped away from it, she was free, but also unsure of what freedom really meant. Freedom can be scary, Jake said thoughtfully. It's not always easy to know what to do when you're the one in control. But that's the thing, now you get to decide. You're not bound by anyone else's plan anymore. Sophie looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for some kind of reassurance. But what if I don't know what I want? Jake smiled softly, a hint of understanding in his expression. That's okay. Nobody knows right away. Life's a journey. You figure it out as you go. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the quiet of the room allowing the weight of their conversation to settle in. The village outside was slowly coming to life, the streets bustling with people starting their day. The warmth of the sun streaming through the window was a sharp contrast to the cold they had faced only hours before. Finally, Sophie spoke again, her voice quieter this time. I think I want to stay here for a while. Not forever, but just long enough to figure things out. I need a break. I need to be away from all of it. Away from my family, from the expectations, from everything. Jake didn't hesitate. Then stay. Take the time you need. Sophie met his gaze, her expression softer now, more at peace. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't think I could have done this on my own. Jake nodded, though part of him wondered if he was making the right choice. He hadn't come here to stay. He had been just passing through. But there was something about Sophie, something in her that made him want to help her find her way. He wasn't sure what would happen next. But for now, they were both here in this small village, far away from the chaos of the world they had both known. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small conversations and quiet moments. Sophie spent some time walking around the village, taking in the sights and sounds, trying to let the place settle in. Jake, on the other hand, decided to make plans for his next move. He had been traveling for a long time, but he hadn't forgotten his dreams of seeing the world. But there was a part of him that didn't want to leave Sophie behind. He wasn't sure what they were or what they were becoming, but he knew that there was a connection between them that he couldn't ignore. He had helped her when she needed it most, and in turn she had helped him too. That evening, after they had both returned to the inn, Sophie was quieter than usual. She was sitting by the window again, watching the village below as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple. Jake joined her, sitting beside her in the silence that had become so familiar between them. I think I'll stay here for a while, Sophie said again, her voice steady now. I don't know for how long, maybe a few weeks, maybe more. But I need to breathe, Jake. I need to figure out what comes next. Jake could see that she had made up her mind. She wasn't running anymore. She was choosing, and that made all the difference. I understand, Jake said, his voice calm. Take all the time you need. You've earned it. Sophie smiled, a real smile this time, and for the first time in days she seemed at peace. The weight of the storm that had followed them for so long had finally lifted, and though the road ahead wasn't clear, she had found something important in this village, a place to rest, to heal, and to find herself again. As the night fell and the village outside grew quiet, the two of them sat in the warmth of the room, the connection between them growing stronger. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time they felt like they were exactly where they needed to be. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had led them to this moment, and maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered. The days that followed felt like a mix of calm and uncertainty. Sophie had decided to stay in the village, taking time to rest and think. The once overbearing pressure of her old life seemed to ease with each passing day, though she still wasn't sure what the future would hold. The village, with its quiet charm and slower pace, gave her space to breathe, a luxury she hadn't had in years. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could simply exist without the constant expectations of others. Jake, on the other hand, had spent the past few days walking the village's winding streets, talking to locals and trying to figure out his next move. The small town had a sense of warmth that was rare in places like this, and he found himself unexpectedly drawn to it. It wasn't like the larger cities he had visited. It wasn't about rush or crowds. It was about people, faces he could connect with, stories shared over a cup of coffee or while fixing something together. Jake hadn't anticipated staying long, but now, there was a part of him that didn't want to leave. One morning, a few days after they'd arrived, Sophie met Jake in the small cafe in the center of the village. They had become routine, spending the early part of the day together, either talking about their past or simply sitting in silence, letting the small details of the world around them fill the gaps. "How are you feeling today?" Jake asked, sitting across from her as they both wrapped their hands around steaming mugs of coffee. He had noticed a shift in her lately, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. Sophie took a deep breath before answering. "Better, it's funny. I didn't expect to feel this and peaceful. I thought I would be restless, always thinking about the next thing. But here I don't feel like I'm constantly running from something." She smiled, though it was mixed with a hint of sadness. "It's strange to realize I was living my life without even knowing what I wanted." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He had seen it in his own life, how people could get caught up in the rush of living without ever stopping to ask why. But being here in this small village had given both of them a chance to pause, to question what was truly important. "I think you're figuring it out," Jake said gently. "You're not the same person who came here days ago. You're starting to take control, even if you're not sure what you want yet." Sophie seemed to consider his words for a moment before her eyes met his. "And you?" she asked. "What about you? What's next for you?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He had been wrestling with the same question. He had always considered himself a wanderer, moving from place to place, living a life that felt free but without a real purpose. The idea of staying in one place had never appealed to him. Yet with Sophie here in the village, the thought of leaving felt different. He wasn't sure why, but something about this town, this moment, felt important. "I don't know yet," Jake replied finally. "I thought I'd keep moving. It's what I've always done. But I'm starting to think there's more to staying than just waiting for the next adventure." Sophie smiled at his honesty. "Maybe there's more to life than just moving on. Maybe sometimes you have to be still to really see what's in front of you." Jake leaned back in his chair, reflecting on her words. He had spent so much of his life looking for the next thing, the next place, the next rush of excitement. But here, with Sophie in this village, he was beginning to see the value in being present. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but maybe it was the life he needed. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, with Sophie continuing to find herself and Jake still grappling with his own sense of direction. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset behind the mountains, Sophie spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about the life I left behind," she said slowly. "I don't think I can just go back to that. I can't go back to what I was supposed to be, the person I was told to be." Jake turned to her, his gaze soft. "Then don't go back. You don't have to go back to anything. You're not tied to the past unless you choose to be." Sophie looked down, her hands folded in her lap. "But what if I don't know who I am without it? Without all the expectations and the plans? What if I'm just lost?" "You're not lost," Jake said, his voice firm yet kind. "You've just been living someone else's dream. Now it's your turn to figure out what you want. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be all figured out right away." Sophie's eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, it felt like she was seeing him in a new light, as someone who understood the uncertainty that came with change. "I don't know how to begin," Sophie admitted. Jake smiled. "You just start. It doesn't need to be big. Little steps." For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt a spark of hope. The idea of starting over, of taking those small steps, didn't seem as daunting as it had before. She didn't have to have everything figured out all at once. She just had to take it one moment at a time, just as she had done when the storm was raging outside the cave. The next few weeks passed in much the same way, with Sophie spending her days finding small tasks to occupy her mind, sometimes helping in the local cafe, sometimes walking through the village and speaking with the people who had offered her a kind welcome. She was still figuring out what came next, but each day felt like a new possibility. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She was learning how to make her own path forward. Jake, too, found himself more rooted here than he had expected. He helped with odd jobs around the village, fixing broken fences or assisting in the small workshop that made wooden furniture for the local homes. He wasn't sure if he was ready to settle down, but there was something about the village, about the simplicity of life here, that felt right. One afternoon, as they walked through the village together, Sophie turned to Jake with a sudden question. "Do you ever wonder if this was always the plan?" she asked. That we ended up here in this place for a reason? Jake thought about it for a moment. I don't know. But maybe it's enough that we're here now, together. Sophie nodded, her smile faint but genuine. Maybe it is. The journey that had started with a chance encounter in the wilderness had brought them to this point. Two people, still figuring out who they were and what they wanted. They didn't have all the answers, and they probably never would. But what mattered was that they had each other in this moment. And for the first time, both of them felt a sense of peace in knowing that they were exactly where they needed to be. As the days continued to pass, Sophie began to feel more like herself than she had in years. She didn't have everything figured out, but she no longer felt the pressure to have it all at once. She had found something here in this village that she had never expected to find, and Jake, though still uncertain of his own path, felt the pull of something deeper, something that tied him to this place, to Sophie, and to the life they were beginning to build together. In the quiet simplicity of their new lives, they discovered something neither of them had expected, that the journey, in all its uncertainty, was more important than the destination. And sometimes the greatest adventure of all was learning how to live in the moment.